Hi, Marion. Nice to see you in this interesting way. I just wanted to give a quick introduction of Marian Drew. I'm sure many of you will know her work. And of course, Marian Drew is one of Australia's most significant photographic artists with a practice spanning 30 years in both education and exhibition. She has held more than 25 solo shows in Australia, the United States, France, Hong Kong, Germany, and over 100 group shows, wow, in Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, France, China, Germany, Singapore, Taiwan, Peru, and the US. So truly international reception to her incredible works. I might start by flicking up quickly. So Marion, I'm showing right now Wallaby, the Wallaby still life we included in the PowerPoint series. And I'm putting this here just to highlight that Marion really is perfect for speaking to the lives of things as we've been doing in this session, and highlight her excellent Still Life Australiana series from around 2006, I believe. Yes, and you know, the animals, so, you know, we looked very briefly there at that Peter Clay's work, and we're thinking about still life as a genre, and of course, Marianne explores that with a decidedly Australian twist. So let's welcome Marianne. Can you hear the applause? It's brilliant to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us from Melbourne, from, I think you're in rural Victoria, aren't you?
Victoria, yeah.
Okay. Well, in better times we would be together, but this is just as good. And I love that you have Cézanne's apples up behind you. That's the last work that we finished with. But I think probably everyone would be really interested to hear, and with the Wallaby up on the screen, just thinking about 17th century still life as a genre and how that has mattered to you in your practice.
Yeah, well, I mean, it all came out of studying that work. I mean, of course, I'd seen it over years and, you know, through my education, but just at the beginning of about 2002, I was in Germany, and I'd spent a couple of days in a museum that had a lot of actually in Kassel in Germany, in Wilhelmshohe Schloss. And then I flew back to Australia, and it just sort of was a transposition of all the animals that I was seeing in the still life paintings were sort of translated into these roadkill animals that were a part of Brisbane's landscape. And I really consciously then I started to collect these animals, trying to work out them, and that image of these animals as a kind of a representation of our progress and our power, and I thought would be a very interesting way to represent, dead photographs of dead animals, which people find, very abject and very difficult to look at, framing them within this historical genre, and seeing them, seeing how it compares to how we think about animals in the past, and but also making it, by using this genre, it was something incredibly familiar to people, and they felt comfortable with looking at this because of history, and it was a way to make them beautiful, and therefore people could spend a little bit longer looking at them. So beauty was an important almost tool for me in presenting these animals back to audiences, that they were very, very familiar with already, that, we are all familiar with these animals beside the roads. So it was a way of presenting them in a fresh way, so that we could see them again.
Fantastic. So that's great, because that speaks to a lot of the analogies that we see with those 17th century still life. So you've just talked about we rendering things beautiful that are, challenging, and, we just looked at the Peter Clay's still life, which you and I have talked about a little bit, where this skull, this focus on the skull, so the idea of mortality. And maybe I would love to hear you reflect on some salient differences with those works. You know, obviously key difference is the Australian animals, but is it a kind of commentary on, or a philosophical commentary on, the still life, and differentiating your take on it, if you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I suppose I wasn't so concerned with the human mortality, although that is implied through our sort of through this sort of this table context of consumption, or daily sort of bodily needs that the still life does represent back to us. But it was about that connectedness of the wild animals, our environment, and of course then in connecting that intimately to our own mortality. But it was the animals. I was saying that it's inseparable, I suppose, or it was. It's quite. It's an environmental work that. You have incredibly rich history to draw on in terms of people's associations when you do a genre like still life. It goes back way past the Greeks even. I mean, the objects we use, that are often presented in still lives are objects that have been used for eternity. So it links you up with all of humanity in these sort of otherwise trivial daily occurrences that we tend to not notice.
Would you describe the works as having a political charge to them from that perspective? You've mentioned environmentalism. Like, is this I suppose, critique in a way?
Oh yeah, I think so. Well, it's by confronting people with uncomfortable news. It's bringing it into, hopefully into their lounge rooms, or into the galleries that they go and look in, and so these works go out in the world and have long lives of their own. And but I think the animal works particularly have really struck a chord with people. It makes you respond in some way. It's quite sort of a visceral reaction, and that's part of it too, is the photograph does bring the visceral into it. It's so precise, and so it's got a lot of information in it. So the closer you come, the more detail you see. So as a conveyance of this idea of, I'm not trying to sort of say this is bad or judge, make any judgments. I'm just trying to present, in a sense, the facts for people to make up, their own minds and take positions. And I have found that, in terms of the politics of it, people do become more aware of these animals, their lives. And people pick up animals. It became like a community project pretty quickly, where people would bring me dead animals all the time, which I was terribly grateful for. and still do.
They still bring you roadkill?
I get calls out of the blue, and somebody's found something that's just been killed, and they want to give it that space, or to have it made visible, to sort of acknowledge it, and then I'm sort of a part of that. So it's bigger than me.
One question. So you mentioned back there the realism of the work. Can you hear me? Are you hearing me okay?
Sorry, could you just say that again?
Talking about the realism of the works.
Yeah.
And, I've read in some reviews of your work that there's quite a painterly quality to how you approach photography. And I wondered if you would want to comment on that a little bit, just the form of these, and do you see them as painterly, not just in evoking that tradition, but in your approach to light and color and so on?
Yeah, I think, the way I've been working with photography since the beginning is, I mean, I suppose I'm very interested in painting and the history of painting, and that has informed my practice from the beginning. And the way I work is in darkness with a torch, and in a sense, paint up gradually the picture in like 10 minutes in the darkness. So that act of lighting up is there's almost brush strokes. You can see light strokes and this kind of build up and a kind of a luminosity that you can get through that technique, where things start to glow, or you can photograph a black crow versus on white fabric, and you can still draw out blacks, and so it gives you it's a much more painterly way of working with photography, really. But it was a perfect match with this historical sort of referencing to these 17th, 18th century still lives.
What has the response been like abroad? I mean, you are such an international artist with such a broad reception, and I'm just wondering about, so right now I've got the Bandicoot with quints up, okay, and I'm thinking about the quints, and the art historian in me goes, okay, it was possibly one of the, the apple in the Garden of Eden, so it has all these connotations, right? But a bandicoot, I mean, and so I'm just wondering about those frames of reference and the reception of your work abroad, when you would have people seeing a wallaby, in that context, obviously for the first time. So just that international reception, maybe, if you wanted to comment on that.
Well, I mean, people, I think, are very, very familiar with the genre, so it enabled, it really gave a doorway into a whole new audience, really, for not a peculiar Australian situation, but it was the juxtaposition then of an animal within this sort of European tradition. I think the invitations for exhibitions were evidence that people were very interested. It's something you can get it. It's easily read, and I don't think there was. I think there were more negative reactions in Australia than overseas. Maybe because they're more deeply steeped in that sort of European tradition, and people here saw them as dead animals because they recognised the species.
I wanted to ask you, Marion, I know you had a chance to see the show before, I think on opening night you were here, and I wanted to ask you about particular works in the Met show that spoke to you and you found evocative. I mean, I know you have the Cézanne behind you, I sent through that PowerPoint, and I think we had like the Crivelle, the Madonna with the cucumber and the apple. Like, were there any works there that you wanted to sort of comment on or say how they're evocative to your practice?
I think the Cézanne is most currently, the most interesting work for me, because I suppose in my own work, as I've sort of left a more traditional still life kind of referencing, and I'm very interested in the way Cézanne, as a modernist, took that, and because it was incredibly familiar already, you don't, and I mean the world had changed, but he didn't describe the apples in great detail. They weren't so much about apples anymore. They were about paint and all these multiple perspectives, and interestingly, the way he incorporates his landscape painting practice into his still life paintings, and that was, I mean, obviously it's pretty evident to people looking at his still life that there are these kind of mountains and landscapes of fabric, and things aren't stable. They're sort of like juggling around, the paint and the colour juggles with the apples and the pears. So for me, this idea of trying to bring the landscape into the still life space was really important, which is really what I've been doing with my animal works as well. You know, I was really dragging in this kind of landscape into the studio, represented in the bodies of the animals, as well as the sort of backdrops I'd been choosing. So this idea of landscape I find really important, because it's, once again, it's that idea of trying to connect us up with the world around us, and that we're not, we can't exclude ourselves from our environment. And so my current work is, I suppose I'm focusing on geology and sort of the big time of geology and the forms, that you climb over rocks and lift rocks, and in my most recent works, those landscape experiences I'm trying to incorporate into frame, and so that's why this design is so important to me.
I love what you just said about the landscape with the still life, because for me, that's the kind of key difference between your work and those 17th century Dutch still lifes. The way you feature that sort of, so we're looking again at Bandicoot with Quince, and that landscape backdrop gives an entirely different feel to how the objects are positioned in the foreground. And again, something I talked about in the lecture just then was sort of microscopic and telescopic at the same time. And that's really evoked in your work in really, I think, kind of like a radical way. I think that's an important feature of your works. I just wanted to quickly ask about like linens, the cloth, because last week we did a session called From Flesh to Fashion. We were thinking a lot about cloth and animation of cloth and how that matters. And that strikes me in your work too. And especially I think now your later work, there are a lot of, I'm thinking of, in particular, from the Strata series, you're kind of activating cloth in really interesting ways, and animation of the inanimate. And I don't know if that was something you wanted to reflect on a little further here, the direction you're going there.
Well, obviously, the cloth lends itself to, these landscape forms. And you look back at the earliest still lives, the cloths are sort of thrown casually onto the table, and there's this, they say so much, whether they're folded carefully or blown onto the edge. They carry all these messages about, rituals and creatural eatings and shared tables. So they operate they still operate, I think, quite symbolically, which is interesting, which is the fruits, we could say, probably don't, because we've lost a lot of that information. But I think the fabric is still very familiar in terms of even like religious iconography. There's this deep sense of ritual in the folding of fabric or in the ironing, and women's work in the home is also evoked through these kinds of this kind of imagery. But the fabric, I've played with the fabric. I love the fabric that has a kind of a sheen and a pattern underneath. So there's this sort of transparency as well. It's not just the fabric form, but it has this kind of memory and shades of other imagery. History. The patterns on the damask, for example, hark back to hundreds of years, really. So with the way, and maybe we'll talk about the recent work when we have a look at the Bandicoot and the Quince, is that the table has become this landscape, and Western Queensland to photograph the bottle tree. So that it'd have this kind of form, and then this echo of the it's you can see in the distance this kind of little rock image, and that's a like a hay bale. So, it was a landscape that would play with, in colour with and form with the tabletop.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I love what you just said, just to pull back to the fabric and the patterning and what you just said about impressions left on these things, seeing the folding. Like, again, my art history brain, I started thinking about this really beautiful study by Albrecht Dürer, where it's literally a study of a Kopfkiss, of a pillow. And the pillow, is this anamorphic thing that kind of has taken the shape, and he's literally there studying the pillow, and that kind of attention to detail and creases and remnants of human presence without the human being there, and what you just said about the washing and the linen, and that's something that's come up a few times in some of the works we looked at in this session. So the Crivelli painting with the beautiful backdrop. So instead of the throne, the Virgin Mary has this cloth behind her. You can see the folding. The Christ child is sitting on this dimpled cushion. So there's all of that. And in that backdrop, you do have this remarkable landscape. I don't know, I'm just imagining our historical study where we draw your work together with some of these paintings in the Met show, and I can absolutely see that analogy. I'm wondering a little bit about the strategies for placement here. They're so elegant. It's and that quality of planning that I see here. Is there anything to that? I mean, how long does it take you to set one of these up? And and do you have to preserve your animals? And that's a very important question with 17th century stuff as well, because you'll see plants from different times of year somehow magically brought together. So that is a valid question.
Yeah, it is. I freeze them, and the freezing, which is a kind of nice metaphor for the photograph, but the freezing puts them into certain positions, and I find chance being a great tool in in my own production. It keeps things fresh and it keeps me interested. So in many ways, it's the chance put into the freezer and how they become frozen, which is how I then use them on the table. So, for example, with the Bandicoot, it was frozen in that position, which is pretty well. I mean, you find them and they've got their positions, and so I don't change them much. I just take them and carefully freeze them, and I will thaw them out so that they're not, so they don't look frozen. And it can sometimes take, months to resolve the aesthetic problem of, this animal, this specific animal. And I did start off using multiple animals to make that connection to the 17th century still lifes. But I quickly I only would use one animal so that it would have its own, individual space and a kind of really. And so it was just it's a process of having to reshoot and resolve. How do I counterbalance? How do I, they're all aesthetic problems, compositional aesthetics. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I'm noticing it's 12, and I'm sure there are questions from the audience. So I just was going to open up to the audience for any questions for Marion. And what I'll do is I'll repeat the question to you, Marion, because you probably won't be able to hear them. Yes, here, Angela.
The works are very powerful and confronting, and we're seeing them in a blown-up format. And I wondered with Marion, they don't say on any of them how big they are. Is there an issue with, normal landscape painting, of course, is usually in a larger format. How big are the works, and does she feel sort of they're the right size to present her ideas that she's trying to present?
I should have pulled Angela down here. It's a long one. I'm going to try to repeat it to you. It's to do with dimension, though. So Angela's saying that the works are very powerful, and they're especially, like right now we're looking at them, they're massive, they're blown up on the screen. And so the question is around dimension and representation of your ideas and how those two go hand in hand. Is that?
Yes, really. Do you think anything is gained by...
Is anything gained by, the power of the size of it, I suppose? And the question also is revolving around like the landscape. So the landscape format traditionally would be very big. The still life format would be smaller. Is this? Yeah. And that kind of marriage of the two. Yeah.
Well, in terms of determining size, one of the key factor for me was that the animal be larger than life. And the purpose for that is to make, because we're familiar with the animal size, it makes us feel smaller.
Right.
So, I was really trying to play this a sense of scale. I feel a bit sort of like a child, lower than the table, looking up, or that these things appear bigger in our, in the image, which made I feel kind of we could make the audience feel a bit smaller in their own body. But that was the main thing, and of course the detail of being able to see them, because I'm photographing them on large format film. And drum scanning them, so they've got an incredible amount of detail, so they are able to and have this sort of exquisite photographic detail.
Wonderful. Other questions? Yes.
Can we see some more of the work?
Yes. We're going to scroll through some of your works now, Marianne. So we have the Wallaby. We're looking at the Wallaby right now. Do you want me to just flick through? The crow with salt. Look, this is the thing I latch onto here is, yes, the crow, but also the lemon, which, that is so evocative of, again, art history brain, like Spanish still life, and, the kind of dissection that could happen with fruit. And you'd often see fruits sort of cut so you can see a cross section of it, but also the evocative way you've put the peel there. Like, it's just stunning. It's this contemplation of skin and, interiors, exterior. So anyway, I'm just noticing that while I look through. And now we're looking at Bandicoot. And then I have the melon with quince. Actually, it would be great to hear you comment on this one. The melon with quince in balance, because this is later work, and you seem to be reflecting a lot there on form and positioning, and the fruits are brought into a different kind of relationship here because of how they're balanced. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on this one a little further.
Well, this was made after a decade of working with the dead animals, and and having a few meltdowns of freezes and things, and I really felt like I needed to bring some air and light and some joie de vivre and some lightness into some work. So I was after, and this is like an outdoor studio in the bush. You can sort of see the palms behind, and a lot of the produce was drawn, either from the bush, the berries, or from a sort of a palm, where I go to the beach up north in Queensland, and just buying, local fruits that felt like they could had volume. I'm very attracted to, and of course the theme of balance. So I was playing with the tabletop as a site to introduce these ideas of play and balance. And sometimes, after a meal, we'll play around with all the things on the table, and if you're drinking a glass of wine, you might start balancing this with that. And so it's a kind of a part of table play, and I thought that that's also an important aspect of our lives and the way we commune together. And and almost as a centerpiece for a table, you know, it can stimulate conversations around these themes. And the bits of wood were picked up off the beach, you know, they were driftwoods, you know, they'd been worn from the ocean, so they all had their own sort of character. But yeah, it was really, I think, a reply to my previous body of work, which tended to be sort of darker, blacker, you know, and representing of death.
Yeah, and the fruit here seems very much alive, like there's no sense of rot. Like I'm thinking, yeah, you think of these 17th century still lifes where they're contemplating mortality and death through the rot, and in fact presence of flies and things like that. But your fruit,
Absolutely. And yeah, that's right. Well, because I mean, flies were a part of my studio.
of course they were. You had you had dead animals and decomposing things in there. Absolutely.
Yeah, you don't forget that easily. The smell, and you know, in the reality of working with dead animals, you know, it was a great privilege and incredibly fascinating. But there's definitely this other side of the handling of them. And yes, I really felt like I needed something, where I could breathe.
That's wonderful. Other questions for Marion while we have her? Yes.
I'd actually just like to know, Marion did a wonderful portrait of Lydia Pearson from the Brisbane.
Lydia Pearson. A wonderful portrait of Lydia Pearson.
Oh yeah. Well, we were working together for a couple of years on a sort of a collaborative project called Baroque Lab, and we started to. I mean, Lydia works with fabrics in brilliant ways, and some of the tabletops with Baroque Lab were these landscapes of fabric to a sort of a rococo level, you know, trying to make it over the top with sort of, you know, waterfalls cascading. I was projecting waterfalls. So definitely, and we started up in this, we started this kind of project based on this experience up from where you're looking at this picture, up at 1770, and pulling driftwoods, and it was very much about making do with what we had, finding, you know, the beauty in the mundane.
Was your question from
Lab, which we would want to share with people. Yeah.
Oh, the comment further was that the portrait, it was such an intimate size, and compared to your still life of the animals. So is the question sort of like your different approaches to like the portraits or the human versus the kind of blowing up of the dimensions of the animals and the fruit? Yeah.
So yeah, the portrait I did of Lydia, for example, I mean, working with somebody like Lydia who's highly aesthetic, and you know, she brings a lot to collaboration, and but still, you know, I was sort of very conscious of the history of portraiture, and so I was like with that portrait, I don't have that here, but you know, one of the you know, I was reconstituting the photograph within this sort of still life context. So and it relates to the work of strata that you referred to before, which I think you might have a slide of. So this tearing of the photographic paper, which sort of comes back to, you know, modernism, I suppose, and that sort of making clear what is the material that we're using. Yeah. So this tearing up of the photographs and reconstituting them back within this, you know, shallow space, which, you know, still links to still lives. And with the portrait of Lydia, there were some lemons tossed to the side, and Lydia's, so I made a portrait of her with quite an elaborate backdrop. You know how you make things and then they don't, you know, you sit with them and then you can tear them up.
Yeah.
So, because I had this time and close relationship, I felt like, well, I knew her very well, and I could reveal only a small piece of her. I sort of tore the paper and it sort of went through half of her face, but, she was still strongly present
Yes.
because of the time we'd spent making that photograph and the backdrop, which related to sort of Indian miniatures, which is also relates to her work. And so it had this kind of foliage, and so yeah, it was a layered process, and I liked the reference of the layering within the portrait, and of course it still holds on to my own practice in that sort of continuum.
We have time for maybe one more question. Anyone? Yes.
You asked the question earlier about how long it took to set up those still lifes. And there was the comment about the defrosting the animals. I understand that takes a while. But I was interested in the time it took and the intention that went into the placement of the napkins and the folds.
Yeah.
And how that came together in the picture.
Okay, so the question is again about placement and composition within your photographs. So the idea that, very interested in hearing about how you took the animals out of the freeze, placed them there, but the question is more to do with the fabrics and the placement of the fabrics and structuring that aspect, that component of the photographs.
Well, I guess that connects to how I make the pictures, and so the studio is a site where you collect things, and then they become ingredients. And the studio is connected to the home, so there's this sort of backwards and forwards flow through. Fabrics, ironing and doing sort of domestic kind of activities, and then bringing them back out into the studio. But it's a very much a matter of trial and error. And I love, that's what I love about photography, is that you can trial something and sort of take a proof or something, or at that stage, and then it changes so much through the photographic act, because I might be positioning things, but then I'm still re-photographing them with painted light. So it can transform something that you pick up off the floor and you think is completely irrelevant or weird, and then reconstitute it, and so it becomes this game of a lot of trial and error. I do to make a lot of pictures before I can resolve one. That's, I don't know, but always inviting chance into the equation so that it doesn't become sort of all about me or constricted by a self-conscious kind of placement and awareness of history. I try to bring it into the present, and make it relevant to us today.
That's fantastic. I love that, inviting chance and thinking about the very contemporary lens that you bring to our thoughts on this whole show, and the role of the genre of still life in that evolution of painting, and then now this embrace, thinking about photography and what that brings. So, Marion, thank you so much for your time, for zooming into us. When you're back in Brisbane, let's go for a coffee. And have a nice chat and continue this discussion. So let's thank Marianne for her wonderful contribution.